An open letter to President Donald J. Trump. Mr. President, a century-old deep wound in the soul of humanity must be closed. Numerous countries have taken the steps to do so. We must follow their lead. I am an American by choice. I supported you since you walked down that escalator to announce your candidacy. Your policies are reflected on my blog. Having fully informed myself about the history of the Armenian people, my conscience would not allow me to stay silent. I believe that most Americans will feel the same way. This open wound, this open letter, is about a matter that can no longer be ignored. The Armenian Genocide. It has been used as a political football in the longest period of obfuscation and political treachery in history. With your courage and determination, Mr. President, we can address this tragedy and allow the Armenian community to look forward and hopefully to heal. I thought that the American people who may not be familiar with the history and culture of the Armenians and their contributions to every country that they lived in deserve a summary. Retracing the Armenian Genocide a century after it occurred is not an exercise in historical mining, revisionism, or guilt assignment. The guilty parties, Mr. President, to the Armenian Genocide have been identified. Historical documentation has been provided. Testimonials from survivors of the first genocide in the 20th century have been accumulated. Many countries have officially acknowledged the Armenian Genocide. Several have even outlawed the denial of the genocide. Yet, the United States, my wonderful and honored country, has not officially, through an act of Congress signed by the President, recognized the crime against humanity by the Ottomans as genocide. The Armenians have suffered immensely throughout the centuries. The memories of the genocide are etched in every Armenian soul. They repeatedly faced horrific retaliation and death. The perpetrators got away with it almost every time. That is why it was repeated within the Ottoman Empire and in many countries as well. Even Hitler, Mr. President, used it as a pretext for the Holocaust. He thought he could get away with it, as did the Ottomans, and the perpetrators would escape punishment. The genocide of 1915-1923 referred to in the history books was not the first mass crime. The wrath of the Ottomans was manifested earlier and frequently in the years 1894, 1895, 1896, and 1909. In the 1890s, the Armenians were pressing for political reforms within the repressive and autocratic Ottoman Empire, calling for constitutional government. Oh, what a tragedy that is, constitutional government. The right to vote and to repeal the special tax imposed on them for being Christians. There were clearly clashes of culture. Educated, progressive, Western-minded Armenians versus the old Turkish God whose only interest was to expand a decaying empire, in which not a single institution of higher learning could be found. They were Christians, well-educated and prominent in the professions, and they were democratically minded, as their actions frequently demonstrated. The Armenians formed political organizations whose goals were to achieve greater autonomy. Their loyalty to the Sultanate was questioned. It always was. The Turkish Sultan Abdul Hamid told a reporter how he would deal with the Armenians. I quote him, "I will give them a box on the ear which will make them relinquish their revolutionary ambitions." Yes, Mr. President, the genocide was systematically and regularly directed by the Ottoman government at the highest level. Between 1894 and 1896, over 300,000 Armenians were massacred. In July 1908, junior army officers, the Young Turks, became more organized, having formed the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP. They took over the government and forced the Sultan to allow for constitutional government and guarantee basic rights. But this did not last. In 1913, the Young Turks seized full control of the government via a coup. They wanted to unite all the Turkic people, create new Turkish empire with one language and one religion. Islamic nationalism was on the rise. They may well have been the foundation for the Muslim Brotherhood. Standing in the way of the expansion east were 2.5 million Armenians who were Christians and designated as infidels. They were presumed collaborators of sympathetic to Russia, a Christian nation. In 1909, 200 villages were plundered and 30,000 Armenians were massacred. The Turkish government started the genocide by arresting and executing several hundred Armenian intellectuals on April 24, 1915, a very important date for the Armenian people. They were accused of preparing to facilitate a Franco-British landing. When the Ottomans were challenged by the Americans, they claimed that it was a precautionary measure. They went even further. Turkey disarmed the entire Armenian population. All Armenians serving in the Turkish army had their arms confiscated. They were sent to labor camps, building roads. Death visited most of them. In 1915, a mass deportation of Armenians started in earnest. Armenians were pushed out of their villages and forced into hot desert without food and shelter. Corpses littered the landscape. Turkey expanded the deportation regardless of distance to desert regions in the south, today northern and eastern Syria and Iraq. Women and men were raped. Yes, men were raped. Many were subjugated and forced to serve as maids or members of the Turkish harems. Men, for the most part, were simply shot and buried in mass graves. The genocide was systematic, authorized, and organized by the government, reported the New York Times in 1915. There were reprisals against the Armenians in 1920 through 1923. The net results were, as estimated by the University of Minnesota Center for Holocaust and Genocide, that the Armenian population declined from 2.133 million in 1914 to only 387,800 in 1922, a horrific decimation. Some made it to neighboring countries like Lebanon and Syria. The others simply perished. The commonly used number of dead in the Armenian genocide is 1.5 million souls. The Turkish government allowed the confiscation of abandoned Armenian properties. Such property confiscations encouraged the perception that Armenians were all wealthy and their wealth was ill-gotten. This only increased the assault. No restitution of any kind was ever paid. I close with the following quotation from Consul Leslie A. Davis, writing from Harput to his boss, the United States ambassador in Constantinople. "I do not believe," he said, "that there was ever been a massacre in the history of the world so general and thorough as that which being perpetrated in this region, or that is more fiendish, diabolical scream has ever been conceived in the mind of man. No trials of consequence were ever held." Mr. President, the United States must formally acknowledge the horrors of the past experienced by the Armenians, if only to eliminate even the possibility of its reoccurrence anywhere. The Armenian people have contributed substantially to the progress of the United States. They deserve peace and reconciliation with their tragic past. An acknowledgement of the genocide will send a signal that no matter the time and place and the size of the abuse, the perpetrators of genocide will be identified and will face justice. In the early part of the 20th century, there were no Nuremberg-style trials, no international court of justice, and no United Nations. But there was always the United States standing beside the abused, the forgotten, and the innocent in the name of fairness and justice. Mr. President, the diplomatic and economic relationship with Turkey and the Muslim world are very important, to be sure. But acknowledging the genocide will lead Turkey to focus on its future and learn lessons from its past. Yes, there are economic and political costs, but incurring them now is better than letting them fester. The denial of the genocide is an extension of the genocide. This is a crime in and of itself. It is a double murder, the physical act followed by the destruction of the memory of that act. Turkey has spared no effort to prevent the recognition of the act. Many countries, including Germany, Russia, China, found ways to deal with their dark past. Even Rwanda dealt with double genocide. Turkey will find a way if America will not continue to give them the last reason for calling genocide a mere incident. In March 2010, a U.S. congressional panel voted to recognize the horrific episode as what it was, genocide per se. This followed a series of actions, albeit incomplete, by the United States government. The Senate resolution of May 11, 1920, congratulating the Armenian people on their new independent state and mentioning large-scale massacres of Armenians. President Reagan Proclamation 4838 on April 22, 1981. It acknowledged the Armenian genocide, among others, with no prescription or commitments to a congressional resolution. The House of Representatives resolution of September 10, 1984, acknowledging that the Armenians were victims of genocide perpetrated by Turkey, and proclaimed April 24 National Day of Remembrance of Man's Inhumanity to Man. It is time to liberate the Armenian community from their nightmare. They will never forget the genocide, but will learn from its lessons and from the courageous act of your government in acknowledging that what happened during 1915-1923 was indeed genocide, putting the blame squarely on Turkey and demanding restitution for the Armenians. This will further confirm your stated position on protecting the Christians in the Middle East and will send a clear signal to Turkey, that has a long history of persecuting Christians and Kurds, to focus on reconciliation and the human rights of all of its citizens. This will make America even greater, Mr. President. First, welcome both of you. I'm delighted that you are here. First, give us your reaction to the open letter to the President.
Well, I think the letter is very powerful. There's a lot of content, background, and very sympathetic to the Armenian cause, which is a universal issue. And I hope the President and his administration would pay attention and try to correct a historic wrong that has been committed against the Armenian nation that still goes unrecognized and unpunished after a century.
What form will that correction take?
Well, this is a little complicated issue. Most people confuse recognition with foreign policy. The sad part is that over the past several decades, various